Welcome, everybody, to the Cincinnati Reds Weekly Show on the Gruely Truth Sports Network. I'm your host for the Cincinnati Reds Weekly Show, Mike Goodpastor, and today we're going to talk about the 5 players most likely to snag that added 26 extra man spot on the Major League roster. And we're going to go back and do a little bit of a historical view of the 10 greatest players in Cincinnati Reds history. So we're going to start off and we're going to talk about the extra spot that was added to the opening day rosters this year by Major League Baseball. And we're going to look at which 5 Cincinnati Reds players are most likely to snag that coveted spot. Now, the 2020 season will offer a new opportunity for several players throughout Major League Baseball. The league has expanded the active roster from 25 to 26 with a likely cap on only 13 pitchers. The Cincinnati Reds have an excessive amount of talent on this year's roster. So who's most likely to snag that extra roster spot? Now, according to MLB.com, the number of pitchers limited to the 26-man roster is yet to be determined. But it is assumed that the number of hurlers will be capped at 13. Now, since David Bell and his staff carried 13 pitchers on the roster during the majority of last season, that 26th spot will likely fall to a position player. With the additions of Shogo Akiyama, Nick Castellanos, and Mike Moustakas, that will be welcome news to several players on the Reds roster. Those 3 are expected to be major factors in the Cincinnati Reds lineup, so that additional spot gives a few players a chance to maintain a roster spot, albeit in a different capacity. Now, how will Bell and the coaches use that extra spot? Number 1, having Michael Lorenzen on the roster. He's a capable player of pitching and playing in the outfield, will certainly give Bell more options and more flexibility. That final spot could be no more than a power hitter used exclusively in pinch hit situations, or perhaps the Reds manager would prefer to use the spot for an elite defender. The only restriction to the 26th spot is that said player must be a part of the 40-man roster. No real surprise there, but should a non-roster invitee snag the final spot, a corresponding move would be required. So today we're going to look at what 5 players might the Reds consider for that 26th and final spot on the opening day roster. We're going to start off with Mark Payton, who's an outfielder. The Reds made just one selection in the 2019 Rule 5 draft, and that was Payton. Formerly of the Yankees and A's, he was taken by the Reds on the final day of the 2019 winter meetings. Though he didn't play a lick at the major league level in 2019, Payton has power and the ability to play all 3 outfield positions. The former Texas Longhorn will have some stiff competition in the Reds outfield, as we alluded to before. And, you've also got Aquino, Winker, Schebler, all guys that we didn't even bring up, and Senzel. So being a Rule 5 draft pick works both for and against Payton. The Reds are unable to option Payton to the minors should he not make the cut, meaning the club is likely to give the 28-year-old a very long look. Unfortunately, that look will only last until cutdown day, meaning Cincinnati may have to decide between Payton and somebody like Irvin, who's out of minor league options. Now, a solid spring will be necessary for Payton to make the Reds' 26-man roster out of camp, unless Senzel, who's not healthy yet, it would seem like an uphill climb for the Oakland A's farmhand to make it, unless Senzel is not healthy enough to go. Now, Cincinnati still has the ability to option both Winker and Aquino down to AAA, a tool that may be necessary depending on how the spring plays out. But it's a long shot for Payton, but I think the Rule 5 draft makes it a possibility that if he has a great spring that we could see him make the roster. Another guy who was acquired in a little-known trade with the San Diego Padres earlier this offseason was Travis Janikowski. Now, initially the thought was that Janikowski would give the Reds an outfielder capable of taking over duties in center field in the event that Senzel was unable to start the season on the active roster. A few off-season acquisitions quickly changed that thinking. Now, Janikowski surely didn't like the Reds' acquisition of Akiyama, a player who profiles similar and was given a 3-year, $21 million deal. Janikowski and Akiyama both had the capability to play all over the outfield, but Akiyama's offensive profile is much stronger than Janikowski's, who looks to be more of a defensive first outfielder. The one area where Janikowski could excel is on the base pass. Given the Reds' current roster, Cincinnati has very few players that would be considered burners. In fact, with Jose Peraza in Boston and Billy Hamilton now in San Francisco, Senzel may be the fastest player on the team. Could the Reds use Jankowski exclusively as a defensive replacement and a pinch hitter, or pinch runner, I mean? That may seem odd, but given the way the roster sets up, having a player occupy that 26th spot who has a specific job may be the route that David Bell takes. Jankowski hit just 182 last season, though, and he did have 15 defensive runs saved. So if you want to look at maybe a contrarian way to do this, Jankowski could be that answer. Another answer, possibly, is in the infield, with Alex Blandino, who has minor league options remaining. So his inclusion on the 26-man roster is a bit more flexible than Payton or Jankowski, both of whom are out of options. However, with the injury to Suarez and a lack of depth at shortstop behind Freddie Galvis, Blandino's inclusion on the roster may be quite necessary when the season begins. Without a solid backup at shortstop, Kyle Farmer may be the first player off the Reds' bench should Galvis get hurt or need a day off. Now, while Farmer spent his entire career playing up the middle of the infield during his college days at Georgia, the 29-year-old has only played one inning there since becoming a professional. Enter Alex Blandino, who played 11 games at shortstop during the 2018 season before succumbing to a knee injury that robbed him of the majority of the 2019 season. Blandino also has the ability to play all over the diamond, including third base, something that may come in handy if Suarez misses considerable time to begin the season. Now, Blandino is not going to dazzle anybody with his pop and his bat, but the former first-round pick does get on base. For his career, the 27-year-old has a career OBP of 349, an on-base percentage of 420 in 36 at-bats last season. Blandino could be a nice addition as a 26th man on the Reds roster, but he does have minor league options remaining should he not be able to cut the mustard during camp. Now, the fourth guy that's intriguing to me is Matt Davidson. And much like Payton, Davidson did not play a single inning in the majors last season. However, he showcased a tremendous amount of power at the plate, smashing 33 home runs for AAA Nashville, the Pacific Coast League. Like Blandino, Suarez's injury may dictate Davidson's standing on the Reds roster. Davidson, a former first-round pick of the Diamondbacks in 2009, has seen some major success at the major league level. Davidson certainly has the power, as seen with his career .435 slugging percentage. However, his lack of contact can be problematic. His strikeout rate, according to Fangraphs, is 34.5. Davidson profiles as a boomer-bust type of major leaguer, which isn't all bad for that 26th spot on the roster. While the additions of Castellanos and Moustakas certainly provide the Reds with a boost in the power department, a team can never have enough talented hitters capable of changing the game with one swing of the bat. Matt Davidson also has some familiarity with first base. Throughout his career, Davidson has seen 59 starts at first base, starting 41 games there for the Chicago White Sox back in 18. The Reds have little to no depth to speak of behind Votto and Josh Van Meter, being the most likely to give the six-time All-Star a day off. Now, the final and fifth guy here is Christian Colon, who's an infielder. Now, he has an uphill climb to make the Reds opening day roster, but all these guys do, and he's faced pressure-packed situations before. Colon was the hero during the Kansas City Royals' 2015 World Series clinching Game 5 victory, slapping an RBI single in the left field in the top of the 12th inning that broke the 2-2 tie. Colon will need to display some similar magic this spring. Now, Colon is the type of player that every fan throughout Reds country should be rooting for this spring. The 30-year-old played the majority of 2019 season at AAA Louisville and found his way onto the big league roster near the end of September, playing in just 17 games for the Reds last season. Colon had 3 hits and just 6 at-bats. Last year was Colon's first big league action since 2017 with the Miami Marlins. After heroics displayed by Colon in Game 5 of the 15 World Series, he saw little success at the major league level. Colon hit just .213 in 78 games between 16 and 17, racking up 1 home run and 13 RBIs. However, Colon's bat found a sweet spot last season while playing 136 games for AAA Louisville, and you got to hope that maybe that will translate into this spring And when you got a guy like Cologne, who was produced on the biggest stage in a pressure situation, it's hard not to think that the guy could help a little bit at some point. So those are my guys that could possibly grab that extra spot. Now I want to do something. If you ever listen to us at The Grueling Truth, you know I love historical stuff. I like the old stuff because I'm an old guy. And today we're going to look at my top 10 Cincinnati Reds of all time. Now we're going to have a mix of old and new. And we're going to start off at number 10 with old, which would be Eppa Rixey. Now, Rixey pitched for the Reds in the 1920s and early 1930s, which is after the dead ball era. He won 179 games in 13 seasons with the Reds, and those were the final 13 seasons of his career. Rixey led the National League in wins in 1922 with an impressive 25. 3 times he gave up the fewest home runs per 9 innings in the NL, which is impressive even back then, as all 3 seasons came in the 1920s. As we said, that was after the dead ball era was fading away and disappearing into history. Rixey was an MVP vote finalist in 1924, and although he never pitched in the postseason for the Cincinnati Reds, he had a great career, and he's one of the greatest pitchers the Cincinnati Reds have ever had. My number 9 is a catcher, Ernie Lombardi. You know, when you look at catcher, the Reds didn't just have Johnny Bench. For most teams, Ernie Lombardi would be the greatest catcher in the history of the franchise, but none of those teams had Johnny Bench. Over the course of his 17-year career, Lombardi compiled an impressive .306 average on 190 home runs. In his career with the Reds, Lombardi made 5 straight All-Star games from 1936 to 1940. In 1938, Lombardi became only the second catcher to ever win the National League MVP award and a batting title as well. In 1942, Lombardi won his second batting title as a member of the Boston Braves and was the first catcher to do so. Amazingly enough, that record of 2 batting titles as a catcher stood until 2009, over 60 years later, when Joe Meyer captured his third title in 2009. All right, at number 8, we're still going a little old school, but not quite as old as Eppa Rixey, but right up there with Ernie Lombardi, and that would be our number 8, Bucky Walters. Now, Bucky Walters, another great pitcher, or another great player for the Cincinnati Reds, one of the great pitchers of all time. In 11 seasons in Cincinnati, Walters won 160 games and posted a ERA of 2.93. Think about how much money he could make today with a 2.93 ERA in 160 wins. In 2 World Series at Cincinnati, 1939 and 1940, one a winner, one a loser. 39, of course, they were swept by the Yankees. In 1940, they beat Detroit in 7 games. He posted a 2.79 ERA in over 29 innings. He struggled in the 39 season, but all the Reds did. They got swept by the Yankees. But he was dominant in 1940. 3 times Walter led the National League in wins. Twice led the NL in ERA from 1939 to 1941. Walters led the league in complete games and innings pitched in 1939. He led the National League in strikeouts also. He was a 5-time All-Star selection. Walters won the NL MVP in 1939 when he went 27-11 with a 2.29 ERA. 2 other times he was a top 5 vote getter as well. Walters was a great regular season pitcher, but the 1940 World Series cements his place, I think, as possibly the Reds' greatest starting pitcher in history. Number 7, we're going to go a lot newer. We're going to go with Barry Larkin. Now, I think injuries are one of the primary reasons why Larkin is this far down the list, as he only played over 120 games in 11 out of his 19 seasons. Over the course of his 19-year career, Larkin was an MVP, World Series champ, 13-time All-Star, 8-time Silver Slugger, 3-time Golden Glove winner. Larkin, like Pete Rose, was a homegrown hero who was a multi-sport star at legendary Moeller High School. Larkin, for a 10-year period from 1990 to 2000, was, if not the best shortstop in all of baseball, one of them. Number 6, we're going to go way back in the time machine to the early 1900s, the first couple decades of the 1900s, and we're going to go with long overlooked Ed Roush. Other than Roush's final season, he never hit below .321 with the Reds. At the time, Roush was said to have one of the best outfield arms in the game also, so he wasn't just a hitter. Roush led the team to the heavily tainted 1919 title, which we went over a couple shows ago, where they beat the Chicago White Sox. Whether the series were fixed or not is not up for debate here, though I can say that Roush's performance in 1919 was critical to the Reds getting to that World Series, and evidence points to the fact that the Reds were not in over their heads the way most people today believe. But thank you to the movie 8 Men Out for that. That Cincinnati Reds team was really good. I think they won 96 games that year. Very underrated, and I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that they would have lost that World Series, that the White Sox would have been quote-unquote trying. Roush's .331 average with Cincinnati, a second all-time in the organization, by only 1/1000th of a point to Cy Seymour. Roush was dominant offensively and defensively, was the best player on a world championship team. So our number 6, Ed Roush. Now it's time to get into the Big Red Machine a little bit, which that's what I grew up. Those are my heroes. Number 5, Doggy, Tony Perez. There will be better players listed below Perez. But Perez was Mr. Clutch for the Big Red Machine. And while his stats were excellent, probably the easiest way to see the impact that Perez had on the Reds was to realize that the Big Red Machine was never the same once Doggy was traded to Montreal after the 1976 season. If you notice, Dan Dreesen's not on this list. Now, Perez, if you look back at the 1975 World Series, first hit of that World Series was a huge home run. I believe it was in Game 4 or 5. Game 4 or 5, one of those two games. And then, of course, Game 7, down 3-0, he hit the 2-run homer to get the Reds back into the game off of Bill Lee's eephus pitch. So Tony Perez is my number 5. I just wish he'd have been here for the next 6 or 7 years. Of course, he returned in 1985, so we got to have a Tony Perez day. He was still clutch when he showed up then. Number 4, Joe Morgan. In Morgan's 8 seasons, he was an 8-time All-Star, back-to-back MVP in 1975 and 76 for the 2 World Championship teams, 2-time World Series champ, 5-time Golden Glove winner from 1973 through 77. The addition of Morgan helped to put the Big Red Machine over the top. Morgan was at his best in the clutch. You could see that with his game-winning single in the top of the 9th inning in Game 7 of the 1975 World Series. It's no coincidence that Morgan's back-to-back MVPs coincided with those 2 World Series championships. Joe Morgan, number 4. Number 3, and this guy might have been number 1 if it wasn't for the 1965 trade. Number 3, Frank Robinson. Now, as I said, if the Reds don't make maybe one of the worst trades in all of sports history, Robinson would probably rank number 1 here. The 1965 trade, which sent the then 30-year-old Robinson to Baltimore for Milt Pappas. The Reds owner, Bill DeWitt, tried to justify the move by calling Robinson an old 30. Robinson was so old that the very next year he won an MVP and the Triple Crown. Later in 1970, he was one of the Orioles who beat the Reds in the 19 World Series. Another one of those Cincinnati sports what might have been moments. In Robinson's 10th season with the Reds, he was the Rookie of the Year in 1956, League MVP in 1961, his only Gold Glove, as well as making 8 All-Star teams. In 1961, Robinson led the Reds on a Cinderella run all the way to the World Series, where they'd eventually lose in 5 games to the New York Yankees. He was named the MVP that year, and Robinson, for my money, is one of the most underrated players in baseball history. If he'd have played at New York, he'd be rated much higher. Number 2, and I know I'm going to catch some grief, but my number 2 is Pete Rose, the all-time hit king, 4,256. Also leads all players in games played, 3,562. Excuse me. Plate appearances, 15,890. At-bats, 14,053. Rose was a hometown hero from Western Hills. He was the face of the Cincinnati Reds for a large part of his career, and while the glove and arm were not great, you could not discount the desire the man played with. In his 24 seasons, Rose was a 17-time All-Star, 2-time Golden Glove winner, MVP, and 2-time World Series champion. His return to the Reds in 1984 rejuvenated a franchise that had lost their way. Now, I know the gambling cloud will always hang over Rose, but that will not be discussed in this show. Rose was a hometown hero, and no matter what you think of him as a person or anything else, he belongs in the top 2 on any list that counts the greatest Reds of all time. Now, no doubt, Robinson and Morgan might have been better players, but those 24 years with those 20 years he played with the Reds almost, he deserves to be number 2 on this list at the very worst. Number 1, Johnny Bench. He was the greatest catcher to ever play the game. He's second all-time in home runs for catchers, third in RBIs, fourth in runs. People forget about the surgery he had after the 1972 season and how it affected the rest of his career. How can you not be number 1? You played the toughest position in baseball better than anybody ever did. I mean, this is a guy that 72 was hitting 40 home runs. He was a 2-time MVP who twice those 2 seasons led the league in home runs, 3 times in RBIs. Bench was a key component of the Big Red Machine in the 1970s also. In 1976, after the worst season of his career, he batted like .236. All he did was win the MVP of the 1976 World Series by batting well over .500 and hitting 2 home runs in the clinching 4th game against the New York Yankees. Bench finished with a slew of awards, including 2 MVPs, a World Series MVP, 10 Golden Gloves, which were all consecutive. He was also a 14-time All-Star, 13 straight appearances, and he finished as the team's all-time home run leader. And then we also had, one of the greatest nights of my life, which was September 17th, 1983 against the Houston Astros, where at Riverfront Stadium, I think it was in the 5th inning, in his last at-bat at the stadium, Johnny Bench hit a line shot down the left field line for a home run. I was there with my dad sitting down the third base line as the ball went by. I will never forget that moment, and to me, Johnny Bench is the greatest Cincinnati Red of all time. If you want to argue and say it was Pete Rose or Joe Morgan, you're not going to get much of an argument from me, because those 3 guys and Tony Perez, those 4 guys together, built maybe the greatest baseball team that we will ever see or that has ever been seen. All right, guys, I want to remind you that you can follow me at Grueling Truth on Twitter. We're going to be following the Reds every week from here on out. We'll have spring training coverage. We'll have coverage every Sunday night during the season. We'll have some guests. We're going to have a lot of fun. Make sure you go to the Grueling Truth, like our Facebook page. And if you have any questions, feel free to direct message them to us at Grueling Truth. But for now, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.